Good afternoon, and welcome to our Symposium on Citizenship. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome you to today's event. My name is Scott Smith, and I'm the director of the Responsible Governance and Sustainable Citizenship Project. The goal of RGSCP is to provide curriculum and programming for our students and the wider community on important topics that bear on democratic governance and ethical considerations in our political, social, and business institutions. Today's event, which I hope will be the first of a yearly series of events, involves 4 talks that tackle a crucial concept, citizenship, from 4 distinctly different perspectives. Not only do they cover a wide temporal swath from ancient Greece and Rome to the present day, they also take us far away beyond the borders of our own state. One may wonder why, when we have urgent issues regarding citizenship and immigration pressing on us today, we have brought 4 speakers that provide a non-US viewpoint. I would argue that's just the point. Ideas are bound neither by time nor by space, and the more ideas we have about citizenship, generally speaking, the better we can judge for ourselves how we can deal with the issues of our times. In fact, this is one of the main advantages of studying people different than ourselves. We are forced to look beyond our own blinkered lives, prompted to see the world from another's perspective, and perhaps invited to gain something of a cosmopolitan perspective, not from the ground up, but from the heavens down. Despite our advances in technology, artificial intelligence, regenerative medicine, and so on, we've not solved the great questions of our time. How do we get along? And how do we decide how to act collectively when we think differently? This symposium is a modest attempt to think through citizenship from different angles and rigorous scholarly points of view. I invite the audience to formulate their own questions to ask after our panelists' opening remarks. I especially invite our students to do so, to encourage them to move from being passive participants to being engaged, active respondents. I expect a robust conversation, one I hope everyone here takes with them to discuss wherever you find yourselves this weekend and beyond. But it's time to get started. I'm pleased to have 2 outstanding colleagues here to moderate our 2 mini panels. The first is Dr. Timothy Clark, our RGSCP postdoctoral fellow, who really is the engine behind today's event, having organized it from top to bottom with the help of our RGSCP administrative support, who is now setting up the tables for the food that we'll have in between and after the symposium. Possibly the most important food, although we'll have plenty of intellectual food as well. But can we please give Dr. Clark and Rebecca Norris a hand? Thank you. Thank you. And now I'm delighted to bring Dr. Clark up to start our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Let me get this to work. All right, cool. So thank you all very much for coming. It's great to see so many faces, some familiar faces. As Scott mentioned, this is we hope to be one in a series about issues of citizenship. The topic for this year is sort of the relationship between citizenship and diversity. How do different cultural, ethnic, racial, and other factors define and construct how you define citizenship, essentially. So for our first 2 papers today will be about these issues from the ancient world. So we'll be starting with Carol Doherty. Professor Doherty is a professor of classical studies and the director of comparative literature at Wellesley College. Her research centers around intersections of history, literature, and culture in archaic and classical Greece. Her earlier books include Travel and Home in Homer and Contemporary Literature, which discusses issues of travel and homecoming in the Odyssey and some contemporary novels. Her most recent work, which she will discuss today, focuses on questions of citizenship, identity, and belonging in 5th century Athens. Her paper today is entitled Thinking with the Metic About Citizenship in Sophocles' Antigone. Please join me in welcoming Professor Doherty.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Great. Thank you. Thanks, Tim, for that introduction, and to Tim, Scott, Rebecca, for inviting me, and To all of you from coming inside on a gorgeous Friday afternoon, I appreciate that. So I said that I would talk today about what Sophocles' Antigone can tell us about democratic citizenship, and I will. But I want to start with a different play, one that's probably less familiar to most of you, and that's Aeschylus' Suppliants. Produced in the early 460s, the play tells the story of the 50 daughters of Danaus who arrive in Argos from Egypt asking for a place to live. They're trying to escape a forced marriage with their cousins, the 50 sons of Aegyptus, and as the play begins, they arrive in Argos, reversing the journey of their famous ancestress Io. A young woman who had been raped by Zeus, turned into a cow, chased out of Argos by Hera's gadfly into Egypt, where she gave birth to Zeus's son, Epiphus, on the banks of the Nile. Don't you want to read this play? As the play begins, when the Danaids arrive, the king Pelasgus is faced with a difficult choice. If he grants them asylum, their cousins will threaten to attack his city, and if he doesn't, he runs the risk of being punished by Zeus, god of suppliants. As he puts it, and this is number 1 on the handout, this is not an easy decision, and I'd rather not make it without the people, not even if I have power, lest someone say, if something bad should happen, that in honoring the foreigners, I destroyed the city. No matter what he decides, he's in trouble. The city is in trouble. And he takes a really long time reviewing his options. But in the end, he realizes he has no choice but to welcome the Danaids into his city. Now, this is probably the first play of a trilogy, and we know how the rest of the myth goes. The Egyptians do attack, the Danaids are forced to marry, and all but one of them kill their husbands on their wedding night. But the play ends before any of that happens. And what I want to focus on here is the way that its action explicitly links the decision to welcome the Danaids to the invention of democracy. Remember that King Pelasgus worries that the people, the demos, he worries about the people even though he has the power, the kratos. And these two words are what the word democracy is made of. And they appear together here first. And so the play narrates the invention of democracy, the shift of power from the king to the people, together with the decision to welcome the foreigners. For when the Danaids ask their father for news of their fate, he replies, and this is number 2, the Argives have voted unanimously to let us move here, to live among them. And the verb he uses, metoikein, and its related noun, metoikos, in English metic, is often translated as immigrant or resident alien, and linked to a political institution, metoikia, that was established probably about the middle of the 5th century to regulate the movement of non-Athenians in and around the city. And most read the appearance of the term here and elsewhere in tragedy as a reference to this specific political institution. But this is also the first time that the word metoikia appears in Greek literature. So not only does democracy emerge with the welcome of strangers into the city, but the very words that come to be used to represent both these new political institutions are first invented here together. Now, Josh Ober has argued that Athenian democracy had to invent its own language, and we're seeing that process in action here. Indeed, let's take a closer look at the word that comes to be associated with Athenian immigration. For in Greek, the word metic has a much more complicated etymology that is suggested than by translating it as immigrant or resident alien. Metoikos is a compound noun made up of the word for house or household, oikos, and a preposition, meta. And as Mark Zuckerberg has come to realize, it's the meta part that demands further investigation. Meta can mean with. A metoikos is one who lives with you, who shares your home. And this associative sense of the preposition leads the metic into the conceptual territory of marriage, as we saw with the Danaids. At the end of the Oresteia, to look at another example, and this is number 3, Athena offers the Furies a shared home beneath the Athenian earth as metics, drawing upon the ways that marriage represents the wife as a kind of immigrant, a stranger to her husband's family, as well as tapping into the association of marriage with fertility and reproduction. And yet Aeschylus also uses the term medic to describe someone who has been buried rather than married, buried abroad at least. In the Persians, this is number 4, the Bactrian Artabes died on the battlefield away from home and is thus called a medic of a harsh land. Greek literature often refers to death as itself a metaphorical change of residence, a move to the house of Hades. And here Aeschylus brings the sense of mobility and displacement associated with immigration to describe the experience of dying far from home. Similarly, in the second play of the Oresteia, this is number 5, when Orestes returns home in disguise, pretending to carry the ashes of his own dead body, he asks Clytemnestra, his mother, what she wants to do with the ashes. Should friends and family bring him home to bury him, or leave him to be buried abroad as a medic, a perpetual stranger? So here, once again, to be buried in a foreign land is to be a medic. But rather than linking the medic with the productivity of the land, as with medics in marriage, it's the act and the place of his burial, rather than his birth, that will determine whether Orestes is seen to be part of the family or a stranger. Finally, at this pivotal point in the trilogy, standing at the door of his own house, alive but pretending to be dead, Orestes as medic occupies a place in between, straddling the categories of family and stranger, life and death, as different ways to be or not be at home. And in this respect, as so often, the meta of medic also designates the deliberative space in between to negotiate the relationship between these contradictory forces. So marriage, burial, family, strangers. I hope you're beginning to see 2 things about the Greek word meta. First, the complicated semantic range of the prefix meta at its heart, the different ways that it stakes out a relationship to the home. And second, the ways that this enhanced reading of the medic might be relevant to Sophocles' Antigone, a play obsessed with who belongs to the city and who doesn't, with burials and family relations. So today I'm not going to talk about what the Antigone can tell us about the status of the medic in 5th century Athens. Instead, I'll argue that Sophocles thinks with the medic about issues of civic belonging in ways that connects Antigone's obsession with burial to the play's interrogation of democratic citizenship rules. So let's turn now to the Antigone, and you're probably all familiar with the plot. The city of Thebes has just been through a civil war in which the 2 brothers and sons of Oedipus have died. Eteocles defending the city and Polynices attacking it. Their uncle Creon, the last man standing, in an attempt to restore civil order, decrees that Polynices be denied a burial, that he be denounced as a traitor to the city. Antigone, of course, defies her uncle and buries her brother twice, and as a result, she is condemned to being buried alive. And as she goes to her death, she calls herself a medic. This is number 6. Ah, wretched me, she says, not a corpse. I am with living corpses, a medic, not with the living, not with the dead. Indeed, she's referred to as a medic 3 times during the intense exchange between Antigone and the chorus of Theban elders that precedes her entombment. Now, while Aeschylus, as we saw, uses the term medic a bit differently in each play, exploring the connections between immigration and marriage with the Danaids and the Eumenides, associating the medic with death and burial in the Persians and the libation bearers. But Sophocles brings it all together in Antigone, using the discursive middle ground, also staked out by the medic, to explore the relationship between all these different ways that we belong to family and land. First, Antigone's exchange with the chorus moves from the association of marriage to death. Antigone first claims to be a kind of Persephone figure, the bride of Hades. Then, rejecting marriage as a source of fertility, Antigone next fastens herself as Niobe, the mother who loses all her children and whose grief turns her to stone. Indeed, she herself rejects the analogy of metoike and marriage. Cursed, unmarried, I go as a medic, she says, choosing instead to emphasize the force of meta to represent a much darker view of her change of status. She's leaving her home above ground to move into another below the earth. The instability of the category of medic, drawing upon the ideology of marriage on the one hand and the experience of death, the ultimate change of abode, on the other, thus reorients the productive associations of death and marriage, the rebirth of a girl as wife who will bear children, to focus on the way that death connects us to the earth through burial. As a medic, Antigone is both a stranger and part of the family, the one who arrives to share your home and the one who leaves it to take up residence after death in the ground. And from this ambiguous position, what Anne Carson has called an in-between thing, Antigone creates space in the play to ask how these different ways that we belong to a city or a family are negotiated in a newly democratic context. As Bonnie Honig has noted, the challenge of democracy lies in figuring out how to live in the city as if we were family. And as she goes to her death, Antigone the medic asks the Theban elders, what are the rules here? What are the nomoi? What are the customs for a proper burial? And with this question, she's not just asking about Creon's problematic decision to bury her alive, but she's also asking about a recent change in Athenian burial practices and its relationship to the ideology that supports the city's democratic rules. The also recently circulating myth that says that the Athenians were born from the land, the chthon, itself, autos, that they were autochthonous. At some point in the quarter century before the production of the Antigone, the city of Athens introduced a new practice known as the patrios nomos, and I've given you Thucydides' account of it at number 7, of collectively burying their war dead in a public tomb rather than on the battlefield. One that draws upon the myth of autochthony to articulate the rules of democratic citizenship in 3 important ways. First, by gathering everyone who fell in battle together in the same public tomb, the city gives all Athenians the experience of what was previously available only to the aristocratic few, namely an elaborate funeral. And the rhetoric of the accompanying speech draws heavily upon the ideology of autochthony to make this possible. It attributes noble origins to all Athenians by claiming that they were all well-born because they are all earth-born. Second, the funeral oration emphasizes the connections between autochthonous birth and democratic politics, taking the autos part of autochthony to mean the same as in equal. All Athenians are born as brothers from the same motherland, and so their equal birth drives them towards equal laws. Finally, the patrios nomos, both the practice of repatriating the bodies and the myth of autochthony that celebrates it, extends this ideology of equality to apply to every Athenian's claim to a place in the earth at death as well as in birth. To quote from Plato's Menexenus, a dialogue that puts a version of this funeral speech in the mouth of Pericles' wife, Aspasia, herself a medic. It's not just that all Athenians are born from the motherland in which they live, but, and this is number 8, now at their death, they return to lie in the familiar places, the family places, of the one who bore them, raised them, and now received them. Returning in death to lie with the family that bore you, we begin to see how the play brings Antigone's status, both mythic and medic, to question the autochthony narrative embedded in a funeral practice in service of democracy. Indeed, in her speech to the chorus, she had lamented the problematic nature of her own family in just these terms. This is 9. O mother, your marriage bed, the coiling horrors, the coupling there, you with your own son, my father, doom-struck mother. Such were my parents, and I, their wretched child, I go to them now, cursed, unwed, to share their home. I am a medic. While the pro-democratic rhetoric of autochthony spells out an anti-immigrant subtext by translating autos, same as in not different, as if it were esos, same as in equal, Antigone, with her ambiguous status as both Oedipus's daughter and his sister, calls out this rhetorical substitution and reasserts the meaning of sameness to autochthony in its support of democracy. by literalizing the family metaphors inherent in Athenian autochthonous discourse, Antigone's own family experience, her father literally returned to lie with his mother, asserts the logical and problematic extremes, the challenges of living too much together, literally incest, or metaphorically nativism. In this way, from Antigone's position, the play alienates the discursive goals of a funeral custom that replaces the family with the state by showing the risks of the opposite, of trying to live together as members of a democratic city when you're all members of the same family. And so the benefits of equal access to political status, of having a share in the city, are juxtaposed with the dangers of too much living together. And yet, not just a critique, Antigone's status as a metic, a figure of in-between, also shows how the opposition between metoikia and autochthony collapses, how the competing principles of sameness and difference at the heart of democracy and immigration might be brought together productively. For even while raising doubts about the nativist nature of autochthony, the etymological ambiguity of metoikia also embraces the communal shared democratic goals behind the patrios nomos, a practice that celebrates Athenians as citizens through a shared experience of a civic burial rather than birth. The semantic range of metoikia enables a conceptual shift in the way a citizen belongs to the land, from being born from it metaphorically to literally being buried in it, by emphasizing the transitive sense of meta and metoikia, the way it also represents death, the movement from one world to another, as a kind of domestic relocation. We might even say that the act of moving the Athenian dead from the battlefield to a common civic tomb is itself a kind of metoikia, a resettlement in the service of autochthony. Indeed, foreigners and medics who died fighting for Athens were buried in the public tomb alongside native-born Athenians, achieving through their death the Athenian citizenship that was denied them by their birth. Because the democratic goals of the patrios nomos erased family individuality in favor of collective Athenianness, the practice reverses the anti-immigrant implications of autochthonous ideology, revealing the contradictions and tensions at the heart of questions about who gets to be a citizen. Sophocles suggests that the structural categories of sameness and difference, belonging and mobility, autochthony and metoikia, with all their competing goals and aspirations, ultimately meet each other, confront each other through the in-between figure of Antigone the metic. From Hegel on, the Antigone has been read as a play that presents us with a set of either-or choices, both of which have merit. Who is right, Antigone or Creon? The laws of the gods or the city? Is Polynices an enemy or a citizen? Does he deserve a burial or not? But reading Antigone from the perspective of the metic suggests that it's not about choosing one or the other, but about the difficult process of thinking through the space in between. The play thinks with the metic, the one who has moved to live with you, about the issues of democratic citizenship, to pose impossible questions about how we belong to each other in a democratic city, because of the family into which we are born or the land in which we will be buried. As Pulaskis put it so clearly, and as we Americans know still today from our own continuing struggles with the relationship between democracy and immigration, it's not easy to decide how to reconcile the strength of the people with the needs of strangers. And Athenian drama embraces the strains as well as the benefits of finding a way to live together with others. It's not easy to decide, but from the very beginning, asking the question has been at the heart of the democratic experiment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carol, for that really interesting paper. And again, we'll be having some questions and answer after the next paper. So be thinking about what you want to ask. So our next speaker, I'm very excited to invite Andrew Johnston, who is an associate professor of classics at Yale University, focusing on Roman history, including questions of identity, memory, and culture, across the Roman world. His first book, The Sons of Remus: Identity in Roman Gaul and Spain, discussed how individuals and groups in the Western Empire fashioned their identities in the midst of Roman imperialism. This book won the Goodman Award from the Society for Classical Studies for, quote, an outstanding contribution to classical scholarship in 2019. His paper today is entitled The Local Experience of Citizenship in the Roman World. Please join me in welcoming Professor Johnston.
So while Tim pulls up my PowerPoint, I'll just thank everyone again, as Professor Doherty did, and echo those thanks, especially to all of you for being here. Let me see if I can paper this. Clip this. As long as you all can hear me, that's all that matters. I would also like to thank Professor Doherty herself, because her book, The Raft of Odysseus, really sort of changed the way that I think about the Mediterranean, so I owe a huge debt to her. If you haven't read the book, I highly recommend it. Nothing I say today will be as interesting as that book, don't worry. Without further ado, the spread of Roman citizenship is one of the most significant historical developments in the ancient Mediterranean, contributing vitally to the expansion of Rome's hegemony in Italy and ultimately to the remarkable endurance of its world empire. But it is also an exceptional phenomenon in many ways. For contemporary ancient observers, Rome's extraordinary willingness, indeed its commitment to incorporate others so integrally into the fabric of its civic body, without real parallel in the context of the ancient Mediterranean world, was a social, legal, and political project that elicited frequent comment and often wonderment. At the apex of Roman imperial power, one Greek intellectual pondered the eventual outcome of this process, when nearly all the inhabitants of the known world had become Roman citizens. Addressing the emperor himself, the famed orator Aelius Aristides described how Rome had co-opted its subjects in the Greek East, released them from their native cities, and given them the city of Rome as their own. In one sense, they lost their ancient cities of origin, but in another, they became guardians and citizens of Rome. The result, Aristides goes on to assert, is that the Romans have finally fulfilled the dream of Homer, the poet who had long ago imagined a world common to all. The Romans, through their ineluctable power, have made it so. That repeated question of the Odyssey, strangers, who are you, has become meaningless in a world in which there are only Romans. They have unwritten Odysseus' pioneering explorations of the Mediterranean and claimed the role of universal tour guides. Underneath the surface of this flattering rhetoric, however, runs a deep tension. This meditation on Rome is, I suggest, as much, or perhaps more, about the melancholy and loss and emptiness felt by the cities of the Greek-speaking world, subsumed by a global empire, as it is about the glory of that empire or the joys of participating therein. Aristides invites us to think about the local experience of Roman citizenship and to ask some interesting and important questions. For the diverse inhabitants of the empire themselves, what did it mean to become a Roman citizen? What changed and what persisted in their identities, memories, traditions, or patterns of interaction? What was gained and what was lost? Far from acting simply as a unifying, homogenizing, and globalizing force, enfranchisement elicited complex responses and involved fraught negotiations on the part of individuals and communities with widely varied outcomes. Through an impressionistic sketch of local experiences of citizenship in the Roman world, I would like this afternoon to offer some provocations and sample some of the approaches we might take to glocalism in the Roman world. The fascinating intersection of the global and the local, something I think we're still thinking through in our own contemporary world. My talk will investigate 3 representative case studies across time and space, using a range of different kinds of evidence. 2 of these are places where I happen to have ongoing excavation projects and thus a particular investment in their stories. We will begin with the Latin city-state of Gabi in central Italy, which in the Archaic period was the first community to receive a wholesale grant of Roman civic status as a paradigm for thinking about the dynamics of negotiation, memory, incorporation, and resistance. We will then turn to the Iberian Peninsula. We'll then turn to the Iberian Peninsula in the early imperial period and examine the plurality of citizenships and senses of civic belonging that coexisted in the Roman world, and the discourses and technologies that developed for articulating such pluralism. Lastly, we will move to Egypt and the city of Hermopolis Magna in the 3rd century CE, when the Emperor Caracalla made his famous grant of citizenship, and see how even in moments of apparent universalism and unity, there are still interesting and important stories to be told of the particular and the discrepant. We will start our investigation at Gabi, a city-state situated 12 miles east of the city of Rome. Like Rome, it belonged to the broader ethnic and cultural group of the Latins and emerged as a political community during the first wave of urbanism that transformed central Italy in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. The success and expanding influence of the two city-states brought them into rivalry and conflict with one another. By the 6th century, persistent raiding and warfare seem to have defined the interactions between them. Rome, here in the very fledgling stages of its hegemony, was compelled to acknowledge its inability to overcome its rival by force and the costs incurred by the continued distraction of its attentions. Necessity being the mother of invention, the Romans devised an original and ingenious solution to the impasse. They would allow Gabi to remain a fully autonomous political community, retaining its own laws, customs, and rights of self-governance, but would confer upon all its people Roman citizenship, thus binding together the interests and fates of the two cities. Around the end of the 6th century, a pact was struck. We call this the Foedus Gabinum, or the Gabine Treaty, and the inscribed memorial that recorded its terms survived to be read down into the late Republican period. It's hard to overstate the importance of this moment for the history of Rome and the Mediterranean. The treaty became a paradigm for the expansion of Roman power, militarily, politically, and ideologically, and the first step in the process by which tens of millions of individuals from northern Britain to Mesopotamia would ultimately become citizens of this community that had once been unable to vanquish even its nearest neighbor. But the subsequent local history of Gabi is also paradigmatic. Becoming Roman, acquiring citizenship, did not entail losing a sense of distinctiveness or eschewing of a narrower conception of selves and others, in which the Romans belonged decidedly to the latter category. Within less than a generation, upheavals across central Italy brought regime change to Rome, what we traditionally call the foundation of the Republic. With Rome temporarily weakened and disorganized, the cities of the Latins broke from its hegemony and created a new political and religious confederation. Despite its formerly close bond with Rome, Gabi joined the rest of the Latins. The Romans soon attempted to reassert their control over the recalcitrant Latins. Prevailing in a battle near the walls of Gabi, they decided to make an example of the traitorous city. Commensurate with the extraordinary privileges that the Gabines had faithlessly cast aside, its punishment was to be singularly awful. In a carefully choreographed ceremony, the city was destroyed and ritually unmade, turned into a non-place. It was cursed in its entirety, its inhabitants, its lands, its structures, its produce, and declared forfeit to the gods, with the intent that it should never be occupied again. Archaeological evidence from recent excavations at the site has allowed for the reconstruction of this narrative and an appreciation of the material consequences of these events. Here is the archaic city mapped onto the modern landscape. Across the site, radical discontinuities of occupation are found. On the citadel, an important structure of the archaic period was ritually destroyed at this moment and buried beneath a monumental tumulus of stone, a conspicuous act of what we might call remembering to forget. Elsewhere, an elite domestic compound that had been continuously occupied since the 8th century in the city's first moments was obliterated and abandoned. But in the last quarter of the 5th century, however, Gabi came back to life. A new town plan was laid out inside the ruins of the old walls, which was gradually repopulated. By the middle of the 3rd century, it was a thriving city once more. But like many cities in Italy, its fortunes waned again in the late Republic. It suffered depopulation as its inhabitants were drawn by the centripetal force of the nearby metropolis of Rome, which led to an existential civic crisis. Cicero relates, that by his time, hardly any citizen of Gabi could be found to represent the community at the Latin festival, an important annual rehearsal of the cultural and ethnic ties that bound these states together and to Rome, and served as a kind of roll call, participation in which was an essential part of the tenacious persistence of the plurality of ancient identities and citizenships of peoples who still resisted, after half a millennium, disappearing entirely into the oblivion of Roman power. In this precarious situation, with the civic community of Gabi at risk of vanishing, an old clan reemerged to champion its cause, a family called the Antisti. The family of the Antisti seems to have migrated from Gabi to Rome already in the early 5th century, perhaps opportunistically siding in that tumultuous period with the Romans against other Gabine elites, and thus escaping the traumatic destruction of their native community. Now, in the civil strife that brought Augustus to power, they had chosen their allies wisely once more. Under the new monarchy, they enjoyed a rapid rise to prominence at Rome, not only collaborating politically with the first emperor, but also participating in and furthering his antiquarian program of cultural revival. We have a few fragments and snippets of the family history told by the Antisti, through which they preserve memory of their ancestral connection to Gabi. But the most eloquent evidence of their interest in the local Gabine past is the coinage minted by their family under the authority of the Augustan regime. On their coins, they chose to celebrate the ancient treaty between the Romans and the Gabines. This was a convenient image both for the self-advertisement of their clan and for reinforcing the propaganda of the monarch. In recalling that primordial event, the Antisti could powerfully allude to the dual stories that could always be told about the extension of Roman citizenship. On the one hand, it was that foundational treaty to which their clan, and most of those individuals through whose hands such coins would pass, ultimately owed their place in the Roman order. It had first broadened horizons beyond the merely local. On the other hand, there was the teleological Augustan story of global dominion, of the first tentative experiments in empire that would culminate inevitably in this man who claimed to have subjected the whole world to the rule of the Roman people. The coin encapsulates then in microcosm the idea of glocalism, in which I'm especially interested, the negotiation and intersection of local and Roman pasts and identities, which was central to the ways in which the empire was experienced, understood, and produced. In the end, the interest of the Antisti was instrumental in reviving the city of Gabi. This inscribed statue base found at Gabi was dedicated to a member of the clan who had taken upon himself the patronage of the town. You can see it's dedicated to Lucius Antistius Vetus, a member of this clan. Especially noteworthy for our purposes is the language of local citizenship. The collective agency and self-ascription of these citizens of Gabi is a testament to the remarkable and unlikely resilience of this community, whose dramatic vicissitudes we have traced over 5 centuries, and to the continued multiplicity of meanings of what it was to be a citizen in the Roman world. For our second set of case studies, we'll remain for the moment in the early imperial age, but travel across the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Iberian Peninsula. It has long been assumed in modern scholarship, encumbered as we have been by our own colonial and imperial baggage, that the Western Mediterranean, especially in comparison to the Greek East, was a kind of terra nullius, populated by peoples without history, a blank slate upon which the Romans could easily leave the imprint of their own civilization. Indeed, it is a typical assertion that in the loss of identity and the oblivion of their own traditions, the inhabitants of the western provinces of the empire were, quote, distinctive among the emperor's subjects in being only Roman. Much of my work has been dedicated to problematizing this very idea and to demonstrating that, on the contrary, in the western provinces, becoming or being Roman, whether by this we mean the acquisition of citizenship or the participation in certain cultural practices, did not preclude the felt sense of being something quite different, of belonging to other and more subjectively meaningful local communities. My approach to the negotiation of local identities in the West has tried to move the discussion beyond an outmoded emphasis on processes of Romanization, and instead to highlight the importance both of social memory, an expression of collective experience that identifies a group, gives it a sense of its past, and helping to define its aspirations for the future, and of creative local appropriations and rearticulations of Roman culture. In particular here, through looking at two inscriptions, I want to push on another intersection of the global and the local, to draw attention to some of the ways in which the language, the legal practices, the political technologies, and even the ideologies of Roman citizenship were taken up and adapted by provincials in north-central Spain, not in order to become Roman, but rather to reinforce and rearticulate the boundaries of and relationships between distinct local communities, which persisted as meaningful sites of belonging throughout the imperial period. The first example is this wonderful bronze tablet. This document is in the shape of a pig, which is one of the reasons why I like it so much. Dated to the year 14 CE and inscribed in a rather crude but passable Latin, it recounts a diplomatic transaction between three designated representatives of a people called the Magavienses and a certain clan leader, Amparamus, who hailed from the nearby town of Cusabura, but who was an influential chieftain within the wider ethnic group of the Cantabri. While the text demonstrates a clear familiarity with Roman legalese and official modes of imperial communication, note the consular date especially. The concerns that it reflects and the discourse to which it belongs are quintessentially local. The honorary citizenship that is the focus of the agreement and to which such great value is attached is not Roman citizenship, but Magaviensian citizenship. The legal and political rights promised to Amparamus are guaranteed by Magaviensian authority. The space in which these rights are valid is the product of traditional Magaviensian practices of territoriality. These exchanges of symbolic capital between communities and elites in Cantabria were powerful moments of public ritual drama, and from them Rome was, for the most part, absent. And as the text's disinterest in specifying what the rights of local citizenship are exactly, as this might suggest, Rome was also uninvited. Provisions for the continuance of the status and privileges of future generations show that there was an essential temporal dimension to most of these exchanges. The provisions of these pacts seem not only to have been scrupulously adhered to, but to have been prominently displayed and periodically rehearsed, reintroduced, and reinscribed. Proof of the extent to which social memory and community identity factored importantly into a vibrant local politics of obligation, exchange, and reciprocity. Turning to the second example from the city of Termes, we find many similar dynamics at work. This fragmentary document records a decree of the people of Termes, expressing their gratitude to the inhabitants of the neighboring village of Dercino Acedum for undertaking some act of collective munificence here at Termes, perhaps the construction and ornamentation of one of the public baths. In turn, the Termestini have granted to these villagers citizenship within their community, a nearly identical mechanism of incorporation to that utilized by Rome in the case of Gabi long ago. Despite the fact that the town magistrates participating in this negotiation already possessed Roman citizenship, rights and status within a parallel local system of legitimacy and authority were still meaningful enough for the people of Termes to offer them to the neighboring villagers and valuable enough to advertise their receipt of them. Also worth noting is the unmistakable imitation by the Termestini of the formulaic language of official communications of the Roman state. In the granting of legal rights, SPQT, Senatus Populusque Termestinus, the Senate and people of Termes, here usurps the very famous and familiar SPQR, right? Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. The decree suggests some of the strategies by which local centers in the western provinces siphoned off the political rituals and beneficent ideology of a global imperial government in order to consolidate and augment their own authority, to construct their own hierarchies of prestige, influence, and dependence, parallel to and even independent from the structures of Roman administration. For the villagers of Dercino Acedum and the Senate and people of Termes, these conspicuous performances of munificence and exchanges of capital, symbolic and otherwise, were not undertaken with a view toward becoming Roman, but rather as part of the renegotiation of the meaning and boundaries of the Termestine community. As the last stop in this exploration, I want to travel briefly eastward to Egypt and the later Roman Empire, to Hermopolis Magna. Last year, my colleagues and I began a new excavation project at the site. Here are just some snapshots of the work we've been doing. This accounts for part of my interest in the city, but Hermopolis also forms a convenient bookend for this survey, since from its sands comes the only surviving copy of perhaps the most important document relating to citizenship in the Roman world, the Edict of Caracalla, which constitutes the end point of a historical development that had begun 700 years earlier at Gabi. Promulgated by the Emperor Caracalla in the year 212, this law, very simply, made every free man within the boundaries of the Roman Empire a citizen. The papyrus copy at Hermopolis is doubtless an indication that news of Caracalla's universalization of citizenship mattered a great deal to its inhabitants. But it is interesting to observe that it is after the edict that there seems to have been a marked intensification of interest within the community in localness, which found new modes of expression for reimaginings of what it meant to be a citizen of Hermopolis. One example of this impulse is a votive inscription in Greek dated to the middle of the 3rd century, dedicated to the city itself as a kind of divinized abstraction for Hermopolis Magna, the ancient and illustrious. Sociologists like Durkheim have suggested that religion can be viewed essentially as society worshiping itself, and cult objects like this perhaps especially lend themselves to such an interpretation. Here the Hermopolites are literally worshiping their own city. At the very least, it offers us a vivid sense of the Hermopolites celebrating in novel form the very idea of their own civic communion. Other media were implicated in this discourse of the prestigious local past. In the later 3rd century, in the context of such renewed self-interest, Hermopolite antiquarians like Hermias and Andronicus produced several important and widely read patriotic histories of their town and poetic encomia of fellow citizens. Among the most evocative and representative works to come out of this efflorescence of local Hermopolite literature is this fragmentary cosmogony in Greek hexameters preserved on papyrus, likely found at Hermopolis itself. The poem traces the origins of the city back to the making of the world itself by the god Hermes, who situates his own city, Hermopolis, the city of Hermes, in an ideal position at the center of creation, out from which human civilization spreads. This mythological narrative responds to and revises the geography of Roman Empire, expressing in its own way the global experience of citizenship, the concurrence of both universalizing and particularizing tendencies that developed under Rome and facilitated the conceptualization of new mental maps for locating and understanding the self. To sum up and circle back to Aristides, with whom we began, his carefully couched critiques of the emptiness of a universal Roman Empire and the attendant dystopian Disneyfication, we might call it, of the Mediterranean, in which it suffices for everyone, Aristides sighs, just to be a Roman citizen. These reveal a fundamental anxiety about the loss of other forms of belonging, of community, of participation, of memory, and of meaning that were integral to other practices of citizenship beyond the Roman. He was not alone in this disquiet. Although we have found it mediated and manifested in different ways across time and space, it was also shared by Latins and Cantabrians and Egyptians. Alongside the homogenizing triumphalist narrative that culminates in a world of Roman citizens, there are also important stories to be told of the rich variety of other citizenships, of other ways of being in the Roman Empire. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our second half of the Symposium on Citizenship. We're turning our lens from my own love of the ancient world of Greeks and Romans to another love of mine, which is modern ideas of citizenship, which will bring it closer to home in many ways. And today is a very important day because our first speaker will mention this, but it's very timely. So I want to turn this over to our second presider, Professor Amy Boylan of the Italian program, and she'll become the chair of our department on July 1st. So she's a powerhouse. So I'll turn it over to her.
Okay. Yes, so the powerhouse is reading off of her laptop. So anyway, welcome to this wonderful panel, as Professor Smith said, on citizenship in the modern world. We are going to hear from our second speaker, Dr. Claudia Sbuttoni, and her paper entitled Negotiating the Boundaries of Citizenship, Two Examples from Italy, 1917 to 1947. And Dr. Sbuttoni is a lecturer in Italian studies here at UNH. Her research considers Italian identity in the borderlands/empire and explores the interplay between cultural identity, marginality, and memory in the Istrian exile community in Trieste and beyond. She received her PhD in Italian studies from Columbia University. And excited to hear your talk, Claudia.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much to the RGSCP Citizenship Organizing Group for including me in this very important and very timely conference. As Professor Boylan mentioned, I am going to be speaking about modern Italy. So actually some of the dates overlap quite nicely with what was covered in the previous presentation. So I look forward to discussing further about this historical moment. Okay, so the title of my talk is Negotiating the Boundaries of Citizenship, Two Examples from Italy. So in this talk, just to give you a bit of an overview of the direction I'm going to be going in, I'm first going to give you a brief overview of how Italian citizenship laws work. And then I'm going to look at two cases. So the case of mixed race children, as they were called, in the Italian colony of Eritrea in 1940, and then the case of repatriated national refugees from former possessions. And I will, of course, be giving you more information about what I mean by both of those cases, and then thinking about how did these reconfigurations of national belonging transform Italian citizenship laws. Okay. So first, the overview of how Italian citizenship has been defined and distributed historically. So the creation of the modern Italian state was formalized in 1861. And I have a map for you here, when most of the peninsula was unified into the Kingdom of Italy. So while the idea, like Italy as an idea or Italy as a geographical space or a cultural idea existed before 1861, it's not possible to speak about Italian citizenship before the birth of the Italian state in 1861. In fact, there were no Italian citizens before March 17th, 1861, because the state simply did not exist. So from the beginning, and I mean the 1865 Civic Code, the guiding principle of Italian citizenship was ius sanguinis. Citizenship, therefore, depended on who you were born to rather than where you were born. So the idea of citizenship passing from parent to child, or more accurately from father to child until 1948, is still reflected in the current citizenship law in Italy, which was enacted in 1992, and like many other European countries, is based on the principle of ius sanguinis. So while the United States recognizes ius soli, which is citizenship extended, through soil or the place where you were born, the physical location of the place you were born, Italian citizenship instead relies on descent or blood. So this means that there are large segments of the population in Italy today, approximately over 2 million individuals who were born in Italy or arrived to Italy as children, but who are not Italian citizens because their parents were simply not Italian citizens. These children cannot apply for citizenship until they reach 18 years of age, and I'd like to think a little bit further about why this might be the case. So thinking through ius sanguinis, and I have a definition up there for you, clearly favors members of the Italian diaspora, or Italians who are living abroad, rather than individuals born on Italian soil. So until recently, Italy was really a country of emigration, and this was a way to maintain control or influence over Italians regardless of where they were distributed across the globe. So just to give you a sense of how many Italian people left Italy and settled elsewhere, because the current citizenship law lacks, it doesn't matter how many generations have passed, as long as it's after 1861, you can claim Italian citizenship. I'm sure many of you in this room are actually eligible if you have any Italian ancestors born after or who were alive during 1861. But just to give you a sense, there are currently 60 million people living across the world, mostly in the Americas, who are entitled to Italian citizenship, which is a number that is similar or almost the same as the population of every person living in Italy. So there are as much people outside of the peninsula as living on the peninsula who are eligible for Italian citizenship. So I want to discuss how Italian citizenship functioned in places at the margins of the Italian state, where claims of cultural belonging and national sovereignty were more fungible and contested. So in this talk, I'm going to explore how the reconfiguration of national belonging led to a transformation of Italian citizenship laws. So while I take a sip of water, I'm going to leave this list projected. The column on the left is mostly Italian former colonies and protectorates, and the one on the right is occupied areas. So I know typically when we think of Italy, we would not necessarily think of all of these other areas as well. But just to give you a sense of how extensive the Italian Empire or the areas that it occupied was. So I will focus first on the question of citizenship in the Italian African Empire, which lasted from 1936 to 1941. And it included the territories of what is now Libya, Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And again, I'm going to be focusing specifically on the question of citizenship for mixed race children in Eritrea. So soon after unification, Italy turned its attention to competing with other European powers for a piece of the African continent. So Italy was quite late to the unification game. It was quite late to establishing an empire in Africa. And so it was definitely at the forefront, right, of the government's mind at this time. In fact, the first war that Italy undertook as a unified country was a colonial war, just to give you a sense of their priorities. And so when the fascists came to power in 1922, securing the African empire was again also something very important to them. And they sought to increase the territory under Italian control. So you'll see in dark green, we have the peninsula of Italy with its islands. In sort of a more neon green, we have colonies of Italy, and then the dark gray are protectorates and areas occupied during World War II. So as some historians like Mark Choate have argued, we can frame Italy as an emigrant nation. So Italy was plagued historically by excess labor, and it sort of throughout its history has hemorrhaged people. So between 1861 and 1985, over 18 million Italians permanently settled abroad. And if we want to count just Italians who went abroad for work and then returned, I believe the number is closer to 60 million. So the colonial empire also provided a solution to the issue of losing Italians abroad. It was a way to direct their labor to the colonies, right? So they were redirected towards the colonial enterprise. This is what's called demographic colonization, right? The resettlement of Italians in the empire. And again, just to give you a sense of the numbers, by 1939, about 150,000 Italians had settled in Italian Libya. I'll go back here. And about 165,000 in Italian East Africa. So adding to that the approximately 75,000 Italian soldiers in Italian East Africa in 1940, meant that interactions and mixing between the Italian settler colonialists and the Italian soldiers and the local population was inevitable. So, according to Ruth Benguiat and Mia Fuller, although Italian colonialism was more restricted in geographical scope and duration than the French and British empires, for example, it had no less an impact on the development of metropolitan conceptions of race, national identity, and geopolitical imaginaries. So it is common knowledge, at least in the field of Italian studies, that in 1938, Italy enacted a series of laws that deprived Italian Jews of their civil rights, including their Italian citizenship, that came to be known as the racial laws. But fascist racial policy actually began in 1937 with the Royal Decree 880, which prohibited the acquisition of concubines and the marriage of Italian citizens with subjects of the Italian colonies. Now, this law is important for two reasons. It demonstrates evidence of the regime's anxieties around racial mixing, and it also demonstrates how important this was for the regime, right? These laws were coming from metropolitan Italy, from Rome, not from the local colonial government. Giulia Barrera, in her text, Patrilinearity, Race and Identity, the upbringing of Italo-Eritreans during Italian colonialism, explores the impact of Italian colonial policies on the children of Italian fathers and Eritrean mothers, highlighting the shifting attitudes towards mixed-race individuals and the complexities of racial classification. So the children born of these unions would, in theory, be eligible for Italian citizenship. Before 1940, in fact, the Italian men could and did recognize and support children born of these unions, and their children automatically acquired Italian citizenship. However, increasing concerns over racial mixing led to the 1940 law, number 822, Norms Concerning Children of Mixed Race. The law prohibited such recognition and marked a break with previous policies. So this shift in legal policy meant that these children, as Barrera explains, who were once national subjects became colonial subjects instead. Given that Italian citizenship law at this time followed paternal descent, these laws went against what was previously thought to be the law of the land, jus sanguinis, and highlights that there was a clear racial component to this shift. And it highlights that ideas of Blackness and Italianness were therefore incompatible. So according to Barrera, this law marked a distinct change from preceding policies. So under fascist rule, as well as liberal era governments, up to that point, the government had not only allowed Italian men to acknowledge and support the children that they had with African women, it encouraged them to do so. What's even pushing this point further, in 1933, there was a law that created the possibility for these mixed-race children who were unacknowledged by their fathers to obtain Italian citizenship. So therefore, we see ideas about race and racial classification playing a role in the extension of citizenship and legal status. So as established, as I mentioned previously, it was until 1940 that the prevailing view of an Italian father's child was considered Italian regardless of how its mother was classified, underlining once again the importance of paternal descent. And of course, we have a shift in this policy again in 1940. Next, I'm going to talk about a second example about extending citizenship in Italy's eastern borderland. And in this area, individuals were given the ability to opt for Italian citizenship in the post-war. And so after the Second World War, Italy lost both its colonial empire in Africa and its possessions in the Adriatic borderland. And so just to give you a sense of where we are, the dark green area is the beginning of the northeastern Italy. We have Istria in yellow, which was one of the territories that Italy ended up losing. And then we have what is now Slovenia and Croatia in orange, but also in part of the yellow. So with the 1947 Treaty of Paris, Italy was forced to give up claims to various Adriatic islands, Istria, Zadar in Dalmatia, Rijeka, and the larger Julian March, to the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So it was the same 1947 treaty that renounced Italian claims to Ethiopia and the colonies in Africa, and thus the loss of this Adriatic borderland displaced many people who identified as Italian, but who found themselves outside of Italian territory. So many of these individuals, again, from one day to the next, woke up and the borders had changed and they were no longer technically in Italy. So Istria contained historic Italian communities, although it had only officially been part of the Italian state for 30 years, from 1918 to 1947. And you can see again, Istria is the peninsula in yellow that's jutting into the Adriatic Sea. So with the Treaty of Paris, Istria is no longer Italian territory, and the citizenship of Istrians was up in the air. So the treaty contained what's called option processes, which would allow individuals from Istria to opt for Italian citizenship. So the treaty granted Italians, and we can come back to what that might mean, it granted them the legal right to choose Italian citizenship, but the criteria for Italianness and the right to return to Italy as a citizen were subject to interpretation. So the process of deciding who counted as Italian in a multilingual, multi-ethnic Adriatic borderland was extremely complex. According to Pamela Ballinger, the terms of that treaty required residents of the newly Yugoslav Istria to legally opt for Italian citizenship or become de facto Yugoslav citizens. So if you didn't choose an option, you became a Yugoslav citizen. And opting required that they leave the former territory of Istria and move to the territorially defined Italy. And indeed, from 1943 to 1955, approximately 200 to 350,000 people emigrated from Istria. Some of them went to Italy and stayed there, others went abroad. But what's interesting for our purposes is how Italianness is defined in this case. How could someone prove an Italian identity? So the option process allowed individuals residing in Istria on or before January 10th, 1940 to choose Italian citizenship, but there were requirements, right? And the requirements were linguistically and spatially based. So Italian had to be your lingua d'uso, your language of use, and you had to have your primary residence in Italy. Language use, however, was difficult to prove in a multilingual area. And the treaty didn't define what language of use even meant. And in addition, during the fascist regime, the fascist authorities in Istria banned the public use of Slovene and Croat languages, and all schools were required to teach solely in Italian. So Italian was a heavily spoken language in this area at the time, and that fact didn't necessarily coincide with ethnic or cultural affinities. A further issue was that one had to demonstrate this language preference to Yugoslav authorities, who had to attest to whether or not Italian was your, in fact, customary language. So in the case then of Istrians outside of Italian territory, it was Italian language that acted as proof of Italian national or ethnic identity, and by extension, citizenship, rather than descent. So these children of mixed unions and these repatriated Italian nationals had an impact not only on the redefinition of Italian identity in the post-war period, but also on questions of citizenship. And studying these cases allow us to explore two examples of a departure from the jus sanguinis citizenship law that is otherwise largely applied. So it might seem at first glance that the question of children from a union between, for example, an Italian soldier and an Eritrean mother and Italian exiles from this area in Istria are two separate questions. But there are many points of connection between them. Both of these groups shared a common stigma, existing as living embodiments both of colonialism and fascism. These two groups forced the Italian state to address important questions about belonging, especially how these individuals who lived in Italian territories outside the state should or should not be introduced into the national community, what constitutes Italianness and how it's determined, and how citizenship was extended. But beyond addressing questions of belonging, it also demonstrated that Italian nationality law could be bent to accept or make room for certain categories of people that match an idea of what Italian people should be like or should look like. By thinking through these two examples together, I hope I've demonstrated how, in Italy's recent history, citizenship has been defined in racial and linguistic terms rather than simply through descent. Thank you.